Welcome everyone. So my name's Kerry Brown. I'm the director of the Lau China Institute, and this is part of a series that we're doing on the issues that China is posing for the world at the moment. It's a great pleasure this week to be joined by my colleague at King's College, Sir Lawrence Freedman, who was the director of the War Studies Centre, the War Studies Department, and has written widely, particularly on strategy, in which he's thinking about China has figured in that. And I suppose the question that I think is most pressing at the moment for anyone who deals and thinks about China is this issue of the kind of constant ambiguity of the West, really. I mean, Europe and America. I think Tom Orlick, the political economist, said there's a sort of phenomena that people, in the same breath as saying that China is about to economically implode, are also saying that it's also about to take the whole world over and to start conquering us. So I suppose my first question to Sir Lawrence is really, with his rich experience of looking at many different places across the world, when he looks at China, does he see someone who is about to take us all over?
No, I don't think that is a country that's about to take us all over, but certainly a country that has got considerable power and senses its power and is keen to use its power and feels in a way that its moment has come after decades, centuries even, of being humiliated and marginalized and slighted by other powers. Now everybody else has got to take notice of it. And I think, maybe we can talk about this, this leads it to overreaching in many respects. And like all countries, some things it does well, some things it does not so well. It has problems which may turn out to be very serious, but it also has a record of quite effective, in a sense, technocratic management of its problems as they've occurred. So I think it's right that the people are, in sort of one sense, in awe of China's rise and economic achievements, and on another sense are worried that this is going to be directed against them. From the Chinese point of view, they should be impressed by what they've achieved, but there is a mutual dependence now, interdependence now, and therefore they've got to work out whether their economic strength really provides them as much leverage as they suppose it does, and how much they want to risk their economic achievement by throwing their sort of military and political weight around in a way that makes other countries nervous about them.
One of the things that's interesting when people talk about China is this idea that it has a strategic culture. It has 5-year programs. I think they used to be called plans for its economy. It seems to sort of be a country that's into planning. What do you think? I mean, firstly, do you think that's an accurate description? Do you think that this looks like an actor on the international stage that has a plan? And secondly, if China has a plan towards us, do we, as Europeans, British, Americans, do we need to have a plan back, or is it better just to sort of, are you stronger if you actually don't have a set plan? I mean, does it make you kind of more flexible and more able to sort of roll with the punches?
Well, I think there's two different sorts of plans. I've always, since it's the theme of my book on strategy, is that if you stick too rigidly to a plan, you'll get in trouble because others have got their own plans and their own strategies which interfere with yours. If you just sort of set objectives and then work out how you're going to achieve them, then this is going to be lead to disappointment. So you need, in a strategy, you need flexibility, but you also need plans in the sense of how you allocate resources, who you put to tasks, what you expect people to do, what you do if they haven't achieved it, and so on. So, and in the sense of, still, I guess, in some ways, a Leninist culture, as well as being having distinctive Chinese characteristics. The belief in central direction is clearly very strong, and I guess with a country as big as this, there is a fear of what happens if you don't have central direction, if you don't try and get a grip on it, and everybody can just keep on going off in different directions. So I think from a Chinese perspective, I suspect the plan and the ambition is quite important. The problem is obviously when events like we've had this year disrupt them and you can't achieve what you want. Also, they've been quite public, often, what their objectives are for the coming 5 years. Mm-hmm. And when these seem to impinge on our interests and concerns, then that gives others a clue as to how they should respond. I think also there's always a little danger when we're dealing with other cultures to credit them with sort of enormous insight. Like the Russians are always chess players, and the Chinese are supposed to think in centuries, whereas we only think in the next week. I'm always a little suspicious of this. I think human beings, in their political context, are often quite similar. So whereas you have to recognise, the influence of Confucius or Sun Tzu or whoever on the way they act and think. The fact is there are great shifts and turns in Chinese policy and strategy, as there have been over the past few decades. So it's not all sort of set on a course and they're working through some book that from a number of years ago that tells them exactly what to do at what time. They're still having to adapt to events. And I think also, just to conclude this point, clearly something changed with Xi. I mean, this is not the same China in its political direction that we thought we were dealing with a decade ago. There's a lot of continuities, obviously, but there's some quite big changes. And that, I think, is, so if you just assume that there's some grand Chinese national interest which is influencing everything they do and everybody understands it and they're absolutely brilliant at this, then you're going to miss a trick or two on your own side. On the other hand, you can't ignore what they say they claim they're doing.
And just to sort of kind of attach to that a little, the sort of impression I get is that certainly for America and Europe, the Chinese over the last 40 years have looked hard. Economic models, they have looked quite hard at our political models too. I mean, they have sort of tried to understand us. Maybe they've failed sometimes because we are quite bewildering, but they have, sort of put a lot of effort into it. And I guess one of the things I notice in the UK particularly is there's not a huge amount of knowledge of China. Is that a problem? I mean, I'm sort of assuming to deal with someone else, you have to know about them, but do we need to? I mean, is it in fact that, you need to know about someone when they're kind of stronger than you maybe, but at the moment we can be sort of not blithely ignorant, but, kind of don't need to sort of learn a great deal about China because in a sense, a lot of the advantages are still with Europe and America and what we probably call the West.
Well, I think it's always good to know about countries. And, I think the danger is if you're just working on on superficial, the latest news story or almost caricatures of what the Chinese do and say, then you're going to make missteps. I think it's always good to get a decent understanding. I think the problem with China is it is remarkably opaque in many ways still. I think, there was a period when there was an opening up, when there was a lot of interchange between scholars, business people, politicians. I mean, lots of people going back and forth between China and the West, and I think that was good and was helpful. But that doesn't feel quite so easy anymore. And I think that creates a problem in China not knowing less about us, and us probably knowing less about China. And you see this in things like nobody really trusting Chinese statistics. I think when people look at the Chinese economy, it's obviously pretty impressive, but nobody's quite sure exactly what's going on or the levels of debt, for example, at local level. And people make estimates of these things, and maybe they're good estimates, but you know what I mean. That they don't make it easy, and I think that is problematic. I think the other aspect of that is an attempt by China, which I think is backfiring, to impose a certain understanding of China on the West, that we're expected to think of China in particular ways and not insult it or cast doubt on what it says. And most Western countries have now come up against this at some point, which is often accompanied by sort of crude threats or these wolf warrior types that pass as diplomats, but actually just irritate people, because we actually we do need China, we do need good relations, but we're not beholden. And I think they should encourage us to be understanding China better, but not just the view from the Chinese center. And that, I think, is actually one of the big points now developing of contention between China and the West is not that they're encouraging us or we wish to be ignorant, but they only want us to think of China in a particular way.
I mean, you've obviously spoken a lot recently about the idea of China and its relationship with being a great power, and I'm listening to sort of Chinese strategists and politicians over the last 10 years. This sort of sense of what it is to be a great power is something, it seems to be kind of lodged in their heads a lot. The idea that the US is a great power and China should be a great power, and a lot of other countries are not great powers. Particularly the UK, once it was a great power, but now, no, definitely not. It's not in China's league, in Chinese mentality. If you imagine sort of, sitting in Beijing as Xi Jinping, and you look at what's happening in America now with COVID-19, you look at what's happening in Europe, do you think that they are actually more worried with the fact that their moment of great ambition is coming at them too soon? It's actually, I think they may have had sort of 10 years to sort of be in this very, very kind of potentially dominant position, but actually the space is opening up so quick that it's almost like they're being lured into it before they're prepared. Or do you think that they would think now, right, this is the great opportunity, they're just going to do what they can to take this space, even when it's going to maybe cause them to get involved with things that they probably didn't want to get involved with? How do you feel that they might kind of...
Well, it's a really interesting set of questions. So, 10 years ago, I think I would have taken the view that China was playing it all quite cleverly. It was the economy was growing nicely, very impressively. Everybody was impressed. Everybody wanted a bit of the action. People were beating their way to Beijing. The economic power clearly gave them serious political influence, and they didn't overuse it. They asserted their positions, so everybody knew what they thought about Taiwan or Hong Kong or the South China Sea or whatever. But they made it feel that it was sort of safe while they were doing this, that nothing too bad would come of it. And then this, it changed a bit as with the arguments with, I would say probably the arguments with Japan over the islands. But certainly with Xi, you get a feeling that this is a man in a bit of a hurry, that he is very ambitious, wants to, here he is in charge of this massive country. As you say, the obvious competitors are not in the best of shape at the moment. And so I think there is an opportunistic side to it, but I don't think they've played it very well. I genuinely think they've played this badly by being too overt about what they're doing, and set themselves up a bit now for some big challenges. And the reason for that is, you know, and I think it's partly the problem with the way the West looks at it. You know, we look at it in terms of, you know, a competition for superpower status, or the top of the pile between the United States and China, and the Chinese economy, you know, can overtake the US, and it has the numbers and so on, but it doesn't have the allies. You know, the US is an enormous network of allies, and Trump is jeopardizing this. But you know, I was not allowed to say this, but I still think as likely as not Trump will be out by the end of the year. And a new Biden will revert to a degree, at least, to the old model and try and repair some of these alliances. So first, the United States is that China doesn't have allies. It has no nobody that, you know, really North Korea, that will act, that acts on its behalf. It has, you know, parties that are sympathetic to it in the region, but that's about it. Moreover, you know, if you look at the region, most of the other major powers are not actually trying to ally with China. They're trying to ally with each other's in some degree against China, even without the United States. And Australians and Japanese, South Koreans, Indians, you know, become quite important recently. They're wary of China, and you know, so it's not a very, you know, if you go sort of, you know, have these debates about whether China's Bismarckian or Wilhelmine in its grand strategy. It's not Bismarckian. I mean, but Bismarck always understood restraints on power, and you get a sense that they're probing on that. I think the other thing, I mean, their main initiative, the thing that sort of shouts their global ambition is Belt and Road, and if you look at it, it's not turning out desperately well, I would have thought. Yeah. They've you know, thrown a lot of money around, and they've supported a large number of infrastructure projects, some of which have done more good than others. They haven't always helped local economies. They've often aggravated differences with the local people because they've been quite racist. But the main thing is that the countries that have been the beneficiary of these projects were always expected to pay for them, and they can't afford to at the moment. I mean, the amount of money that's owed China now is extraordinary, and they've got to work out, do they call in these debts from people who can't afford them? Do they forgive them, which doesn't set great precedents, or do they seize assets, which creates even more upset? And if you've got people in these places and the locals are getting cross, is there going to be a risk at some point of anti-Chinese riots and demonstrations and actions? And then what do they do? How do they look after their global position? Because they don't really at the moment have a military capability or military experience that will enable them to do it. So this is why I think they've overextended themselves. You know, this is not, you know, every time one makes these arguments, as you suggested earlier, it sounds as if there's a risk of sounding like you think it's all going to collapse. I mean, that's not the point. The point is that they've acquired liabilities, which is what great powers tend to do. And, you know, at some point these have to be met. So that I think is their problem as a great power, and why, you know, I mean, I think being a great power is quite overrated. It's because of these liabilities. It sounds good and it makes you feel, you know, feel big and important. But actually, you know, the real problem is that you find yourself distracted and engaged in problems that you can't quite control and can backfire on you, as you know, the United States and the United Kingdom have found of their cost in recent times. So so they didn't have to push it so hard. They were doing fine, I think, on a slower pace, but by pushing ahead, in particular the Belt and Road, and making that such a big strategic thing, I think they've possibly overreached, and that we'll have to see may have effects in Beijing and even on how Xi's hold on power develops in the future.
In the UK has, I think, been divided, I suppose, between the pragmatists and the idealists in the last 5 years about the issue of Brexit and the UK being a kind of independent actor that can go it alone. And I suppose that with China, we've never really had a strategy, I don't think. We've never really had a policy. It's always been opportunistic, mostly about Hong Kong in the past, and then really about engagement, trade. And now suddenly, because of COVID-19 particularly, China is a big issue. So for the UK, you know, do you think we can resolve this perpetual headache that others have also hit, in Australia and some people in Europe? You know, your security partnership is so strong with America, and yet you've got to kind of find economic opportunities with a China that might be the world's biggest economy. Does this mean that, you know, we're going to have a perpetually almost like a schizophrenic sort of view? Does it mean that we're going to have a big division where we go with one rather than the other? Or does it mean basically that at some point we will kind of just, you know, have to admit that our economic interests are so strong that we need to somehow create a security narrative with China too, however we can do that?
I mean, there seems to be a choice, but it's a difficult one, and governments don't like making difficult choices. But there's been this clear shift in mood. So if you take sort of the Cameron years, or maybe more accurately the Osborne years, when Osborne was Chancellor, there clearly was an idea that we offered the ideal location for Chinese investment and focus in Europe. And you could see that with trying to get China involved in various big infrastructure projects, nuclear, and then of course 5G later on, and so on and so forth. And then the sort of the backlash began. You recall, almost as soon as May became Prime Minister, questions were raised about, was this wise to allow ourselves to become so dependent upon China? And I think that's been pushed forward by a couple of things. First, the security issues around 5G and Y and so on, which have been pushed by the Americans, but it's not just the Americans who are raising these issues. Secondly, what discussed earlier, the sort of Chinese attempt to censor free speech in the West when it comes to China, and to threaten and take exception to what it sees as slights and on China's good name. That produces a backlash, and it's produced a backlash not just in the UK, but I mean you can see it wherever you look, really, certainly in the English-speaking world, and in Europe as well. Third, you've got COVID, and one way or the other, the Chinese bear a pretty heavy responsibility on this, and these things happen. And we've been here before with the Chinese, with SARS, but the efforts to pretend that they had no responsibility, and what we now see is even censoring of some research papers, a lot of challenges on attempts to demonstrate how brilliantly they've handled it, while everybody else, especially the Americans, even worse than us, are floundering. I think people have found irritating that they sent over tests which turned out not to work, etc. So that there's quite a lot of resentment that's come from that. And I think the main lesson from that is even greater worry about supply chains. Do we really want to be dependent for critical pharmaceuticals or protective equipment, let alone telecommunications and nuclear power, on China. It's great, as a manufacturer of clothes and electronic goods, great. But on the big stuff, do you really want to be dependent? And then you've got Hong Kong, which for the British is really important. And I think the way the Hong Kong issue is playing out now, against this backdrop, and given what the British government has said, I think the British government probably has got very little choice but to do what it should do, I think, which is to honour its obligations to the Hong Kong people. The Chinese are not playing their part in a two systems approach. They're undermining the democracy of Hong Kong. A lot of Hong Kongese believe they have a boat hole in the UK, obviously Canada and other places as well. And we're going to make that boat hole available. Potentially with quite a transformative effect, both on Hong Kong and on the UK. So this is a big deal, and it's a very big issue. The Chinese aren't happy about it, and they put a lot of pressure on British companies in Hong Kong to go along with it. But I don't think, and this is where I think the Chinese coming too early on this or exaggerating their power becomes important, because in the end, I think that's what we'll do, because it looks craven to do anything other. The Chinese just aren't that important. They're important, but not so much that they can call the shots. And the Chinese have got to work out what they think about all of this, because I think, if they do a reckoning at the end of this year, with their own economy facing real difficulty still, however well they feel that they clamped down on COVID, they're going to have to work out, has all this wolf warrior stuff and flexing of muscles really produced the goods, or have they in fact alienated countries that were actually reasonably well disposed to doing what business they could with them? And that's an issue I think they have to face. I think our own, if when a new president comes in, I think it will, if Biden comes in, I don't think Biden. I think he'll do what he can to end some of the more absurd parts of the trade war the US has had with China, and that will be a boost for everyone. But I don't think he's going to go to seeing China as some sort of strategic partner. I mean, the Democrats are now, because of the way Trump has played this issue, wary of both the Chinese and the Russians, because of Trump's own strange affections for authoritarian leaders rather than democratic ones. So I think there's a bit of reckoning for Xi, and whether he's capable of doing it, whether his position is as unassailable as he's tried to make it, I don't know. But if I was in his inner circle, I'd be trying to pose some questions about this.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's, a colleague of mine. I guess the very final question I will ask you, very quick question. From what you're saying, we shouldn't be afraid, but we should be concerned. So, I mean, a lot of people are now very, very afraid and think China is going to start marching in and running the world. But from what you're saying, it seems that it's got many issues of its own, and we should be concerned, but maybe not terrified.
And we shouldn't be terrified. We should be concerned. And the risk here, the problem with China is that it is genuinely revisionist power in its own region. I mean, I think what it can do in Europe is limited. It can exercise some influence, but we shouldn't exaggerate. What it can do in its own region is potentially significant. We're seeing it's taking quite a major action on Hong Kong now. There's Taiwan is still there as a big neuralgic point. South China Seas, Japanese islands. I mean, there's lots of points of tension. You've still got the North Korean problem a little way. So I wouldn't be complacent about it at all. I think there are big issues. I think there are more Asian issues than European issues. In the end, China is still most important as a regional power. But these are tricky, and they're not going to go away because the Chinese interest has been pretty well stated. And others have got to work out now how they deal with it. As I said, I think the problem for China is that it hasn't worked to develop friends and allies, or it believes people can be bought, essentially. And they can to a degree, but there's limits on that. So I think that's those are the most interesting areas. But in the end, for the internal stability, it needs the economic growth and the strength, and it's jeopardized that, and COVID hasn't helped. So I think it's going to have to work out how it re-engages with the West or on friendlier terms. Otherwise, one of these issues may bite us, but it'll certainly bite them as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed. It's been great to hear your perspectives. Kind of great to sort of put China probably in a better context. So for someone like me who's just obsessing about it all the time, it sometimes, becomes a kind of sort of looks maybe very, very much bigger and more significant maybe than it sometimes is. I'm very appreciative. So this is part of a dialogue with different experts and eminent figures about what to think about China, how to think about China, and maybe put China in a kind of different sort of perspective. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.